Good morning, guys. I'm glad you guys can make it this morning. The title of the talk is Technical Testimony, making sure the jury gets it. I have a little buyer's remorse on the title of this because I really think it's applicable even, obviously within a legal context, but also when you guys are explaining this to clients, customers, anybody else, because a lot of times what we do is obviously highly technical. Now, the people that we really work for are probably not. They're not nearly as technical as we are. So I think a lot of this can be ported over from not only a criminal or civil legal context, but also anytime you're going to make a client pitch, give a report to a client, those kinds of things. I think this will all be beneficial or be helpful. All right, so about me a little bit. You guys know that I'm from Marshall University's Digital Forensics and Information Assurance program. I was also, back in the day, a Huntington police officer for about 10 years. So getting started, whenever we take a witness stand or we go to the conference room to meet with a client or customer to talk about our findings or reports, etc., the challenges are many, and oftentimes the stakes are quite high. Literally, in times, life and death may hang in the balance, especially in a criminal case where the death penalty is in play. So what we're usually typically there to do is to look for and find the smoking gun in whatever devices they've submitted for examination and analysis. And most of us are very, very good at our jobs. We've got tremendous amounts of technology at our disposal to be able to deploy that to find this smoking gun, all right? But the bottom line is all of that can be for nothing. All the technology, all of our skills and knowledge can be for nothing if that smoking gun is in the end ignored or misunderstood. So what I want to try to do today is kind of walk you through some of the science that we use in the classroom. And here in the last probably 5 years or so at least, there's been a lot of progress made in how we deliver content in the most effective way based on how humans learn, especially obviously through the brain. And this, I think, can help you guys in the courtroom and even in the boardroom. So let's first think about it in a specifically a legal context. Let's look at the view from the jury box. Have you guys ever been on a jury? Nobody? All right. Well, here's one to think about. What's it really like to be a juror in that box? So what we want to be able to do is kind of empathize with them and realize the struggles that they've got. How many of those folks want to be there, you think? Few, if any, right? It's obviously low stress, right? Because they're there because they want to be there and they understand everything and they want to be able to put somebody in jail for life or have them put to death. They really don't, right? That's a tremendous burden. How many of them are tech savvy? Probably not many. Stakes are probably not low. All right. And here's the real wake-up call: is a lot of times they are going to be making decisions based on science and technology they may have had no idea even existed prior to walking into that courtroom, and that they didn't understand before that trial started. And again, in some instances, literally, it could be life and death. So from the jury's perspective, this is a very high-stress environment, right? Which is obviously not very conducive to learning, right, or understanding. Now let's talk about some of the roles and responsibilities, especially of an expert witness, or an expert in general, for that matter. Some of these roles are obvious, all right? Some of them are not. So what role does this digital expert or evidence expert really play? Would you guys give me an idea what you think? What roles?
Educator.
Educator. That is a fantastic guess.
Yeah.
Right on the money. Very good. Right on the money. All right. So what I'm going to propose here is that we do have the role of an educator, but we need to have the responsibility of a guide. All right. Responsibility of a guide. The good guides leave no one behind. All right. And here's where I think the science of learning can really come into play. So the best experts and the best people in the room, in the boardroom, when you're talking about technology, and especially trying to translate that technology for lay people, the best ones are teachers. And you guys have probably been in a meeting like that where the technology folks are engaging with the non-technology folks, and you know when it's going well, and you know when it's not going well. So teaching well is a heavy lift. I've been doing this now for about 9 years. And I can tell you firsthand, doing it well is not easy. We're finding out now, Okay, we're doing a lot of brain-based research based on the physiology of the brain and trying to sort out exactly what teaching interventions and modalities work well and what things don't. This is kind of transforming teaching in a big way. So we know now what works, especially in terms of the brain, how the brain responds, because it's finding out now that learning is not this sort of intangible process. It's actually causing physical changes in the brain. Physical changes are actually occurring. So we know what works well and we know what doesn't. All right? Osmosis, all right? Happy thoughts, don't get it. So learning is often thought of as abstract and intangible process, but it's actually quite physical. So when real learning is occurring, physical changes are happening in your brain. So one of the first things we have to wrap our head around, all right, is actually how knowledge is structured and organized. Knowledge and expertise are organized in the brain in a very kind of organized way. If you want to use the same word again. It looks a lot like webs. Okay, it looks a lot like webs. And what these are called are basically neuronal networks. All right. And these neuronal networks exist for everything that we know. All right. And this is important for how we want to approach these things. So every juror walks into that room, or every client or customer walks into that room with prior knowledge and experience. All right. We've got to recognize that fact. And what we're finding out now, based on this brain-based research for teaching and learning, all right, is that the most effective way to deliver that information is when you can connect new information to existing information. So to use an analogy, it's a lot like Velcro. All right, so you want to try to use that Velcro so when you introduce that new technology or that new information, the new material, it has some way or somewhere to land and to stick. All right. There's also some real similarities between how computers work and how our brains work. Okay? Two types of memory as far as our brains are concerned. Working and long-term. Working and long-term. Strong analogy between our working memory and the volatile memory or RAM in a computer. Very similar. So this working memory is basically holding information that we're currently focused on at the moment. All right? And like RAM, it's fragile and disappears easily. The average person can hold about 3 or 4 things in their working memory at any given time. Stress can take a toll and have a big impact on our working memory. So if you will, think back to a juror and what their situation is. Or that CEO whose job is on the line because of a breach. So they're under stress. Their working memory is not going to be what it was like or what it's, when they're not under stress. So one thing we're talking about technology to people that don't understand it, it's not that they're dumb, they just don't have the same knowledge that we have, right? You need to be aware of their working memory, and there's 3 to 4 things. And that is a very delicate, fragile thing that you're going to hold in your hands, figuratively, if you will. All right? It's going to be so easy to overwhelm them. And I'll talk about that more in just a little bit. How many of you guys are good at multitasking? Not good at it? How many of you guys actually think that's a real thing or you guys heard of that before? What's the common assumption? That everybody, it's good to be a multitasker, right? The better at multitasking you are is a benefit. Well, we're finding out now based on science, the answer is no. You're not really multitasking. There's not like dual threads going on simultaneously. You are literally task switching. So when you're doing 3 things at once, you're literally going from thing to thing to thing. And that is going to have a toll on how your learning actually happens. So you're better off when you focus on one single thing at a time. So when your mind is wandering, you've got things on your mind, you're under stress, that kind of stuff, only adds to the problems we're going to have to combat. So it's a myth. All right, you're actually task switching, right? Have you guys ever been to a presentation where the slides look like that? All right. What's one of the main concerns based on what if you're presented with a slide like this during a presentation, whether it's in the classroom, the boardroom, or the courtroom. What is the problem with this?
You're trying to read that and listen to the person talking at the same time.
Exactly. Exactly. So by the time that you have navigated through all that text, you've either not heard a word they've said, all right, or you don't understand what's written on the slide. So this goes back to that whole multitasking thing. It's not going to work, especially in this kind of context. So basically what's going on there is you're really forcing that audience to make a choice. They can either read that giant slide or they can listen to what you're saying, but they're not going to be able to do both. So they may be hearing you, right? But are they really listening to what you're saying? And with the other role we've got to play for our clients, customers, the jury, the judge, the boardroom, whatever, is we've got to act like a filter, all right? And oftentimes, this is where I think a lot of things go sideways in our field, is when we go in that boardroom, the courtroom, all right, or even the classroom, we want to be able to flex our technical muscle, all right? We want to show that we know what we're talking about, and we want to be as thorough as we can and as detailed as we can, and that's a good thing up until a point, all right? But they don't need to know everything, right? And oftentimes we try to move that jury. If you look at a line, we're trying to move that audience too far down that line. Okay, I'm going to explain that here in just a minute. So what you want to be able to provide them is just enough of the technical details that they can really understand what you're talking about and know more. So what happens when you don't filter for them? That volatile memory, all right, is going to max out, okay? And when it maxes out, things can no longer get in there. When things don't get in there, what happens? They're not going to be able to understand or retain it, right? So in teaching, we call this cognitive load. Cognitive load. So let's talk about this just a little bit. So the cognitive load is the burden, notice the word burden, placed on your mind's working memory as you process information. So we have got to manage the cognitive load of our audience. That's one of the main things you as a presenter have got to manage at all times. We've got to do everything that we can to filter out that technical detail, all right, to reduce that cognitive load. Here's what's going to happen. Tons of complexity in what we're doing, all right? And again, we've got to act as that filter. They don't need to, you're not trying to educate them. You're not trying to turn them into you. You're trying to give them enough information that they can make a decision. All right, so let's talk about auditory complexity and visual complexity. So when we start throwing out the jargon and the acronyms, auditory complexity. We start talking about those slides with 3 paragraphs of text or 90 bullet points on it. Visual complexity, right? So what I would suggest is that you are ruthless, all right? You are ruthless in cutting your slides to the absolute minimum amount of text and minimum amount of visuals, all right? Cut it down. Every single word and every single image on that slide, if it doesn't serve a specific purpose, from the audience's perspective, get rid of it. Cut that down to the bare minimum. People need to understand you don't need complete sentences on a PowerPoint slide, right? Because you're talking. So you only need to put in the key words to reinforce what I'm saying. I can't emphasize it enough. The cutting of the words and the visuals needs to be merciless. And that can be hard because they're kind of like your baby, right? You've worked really hard on this, and you want to be able to put it all in there. But it's not going to serve you well in the end. So explanations, all right? Doing a proper or an effective explanation is not really an easy feat. All right? You guys ever done tech support for your relatives? Your aunt, uncle, grandmother, mother, all right? It can be quite a struggle, all right? So those are the same kind of people that you may be presenting to, all right? So you understand that it's no easy feat. So if we look at this, and this is from a really good book called The Art of an Explanation, all right? He's got this continuum here from point A to point Z. If we go down this, from A is less understanding, and then Z is more understanding, all right? We want to move our audience down that continuum, all right? So most people are going to start towards the left-hand side or the A, all right? Not going to have a whole lot or as much technical sophistication as we do. Now, bear in mind, our ultimate target isn't Z, all right? And this is where I think a lot of things go wrong, is we're not trying to get to Z, all right? This is not a PhD level class or a presentation, right? So trying to move them that far down that continuum can be a huge mistake. So try to move them that far, again, past, down to the O, let's say, all right, on that slide. It's kind of like a bridge too far. So our testimony or our presentation, the goal is just to move them to the right. All right? Move them to the right, but not too far. So again, here's an example of where people are going to start. There's going to be a distribution, if you will. All right? Not everybody's going to start at the same place. Some people may be somewhat familiar with what you're saying, but they're not going to be the expert that you are. So think about now when we talk to one another. When you're at the office and you're talking to your colleagues, we're definitely towards the right-hand side of that continuum. So what's that conversation sound like? A lot of acronyms, a lot of jargon. We can do that because we know that our folk know what we're talking about, all right? Or should. So now, if you kind of combine those two slides together, all right, you got the left-hand side there toward the A. This is juror's current level of understanding, and then this sort of like this area to the right where we were talking before. Well, there's this thing called the curse of knowledge. You guys ever heard of that? The curse of knowledge. You may know what that is. It's kind of like where you forget what it's like not to know something. So what happens is you go back to your native tongue, all right? You can go back to your native tongue. You forget what it's like not to know something, so you automatically assume that the person you're talking to has the same level of knowledge that you do. Have you guys ever been to the doctor where the doctor just launched into this whole string of Latin and acronyms and numbers, and you weren't as familiar with that as he or she thought you were, and they left you way behind? That's one example. Now in a strict courtroom example here, all right, in the courtroom, you're going to have three different kinds of examination from the attorneys: direct, cross, and redirect. All right. We have to combat, all right, especially when we're under stress. Okay, when we're under stress, what's going to happen? We may fall back into that native tongue. All right. So our direct examination, when we're getting examined by the attorney that we're working with, all right, that's going to be a whole lot easier to manage and keep that curse of knowledge in check. But what happens when you're getting cross-examined and the stress goes up? All right, it's going to be a lot easier to slip back into that native tongue. So we talked about the curse of knowledge a little bit already. All right. So what's the end goal? Is just to move that audience to the right. Period. Move that audience to the right, some degree, not the entire length of that continuum, but just move them to the right. Analogies, one of the most powerful tools in your toolbox, okay, in working with these things, are analogies. Very powerful and key, and a great thing to master. What's an analogy?
Use an example. It's kind of like an example that is relevant, but it's something that someone else could understand.
Okay. Something that's familiar or clearly understood. This is like that's like this, that's like that. Okay? And this ties that back into that prior knowledge, right? And it doesn't have to be the same thing. All right, something that's familiar or clearly understood. These analogies can unlock that prior knowledge, which we know from science, research, is a best practice, is effective. Now let's talk about some best practice that we can use in the courtroom or the boardroom whenever we're presenting to a lay audience, all right? Visuals, extremely important. We are visual creatures. We are extremely visual creatures. Way over half of our brain's processing power is devoted to processing visual input. So not to leverage that, to have slide after slide after slide with just text, you're missing out on a very powerful part of that. So use appropriate visuals that are linked to what you're talking about and support it. All right, make sure that the visual makes sense and is easily understood by the target audience. Stick to the fundamentals. Don't get into the weeds, just the basic stuff. They're going to remember that There's a better chance of them understanding and retaining the fundamentals than there is getting them into the weeds and the deep details. So start with something familiar. Anytime you're going to launch into one of these explanations, start with that prior knowledge, start with something familiar, start with that analogy. And that's going to activate that prior knowledge, and it's going to serve as an anchor. It's going to serve as an anchor. If you think back to that Velcro analogy, right? It's going to give that knowledge somewhere to stick and the ability to hang in there. So what you say or what you write matters a lot. And again, we're not just talking about, this can also be, it's not just about a presentation, it's about a report. In most everything that we do, a report is oftentimes the final product of what we're delivering to our customer, whether that's judge, jury, or CEO. And those words have a direct impact, good and bad. The words you use matter, and they matter a lot, whether they're written or spoken or presented. Now, in a technical endeavor like what we do, you cannot avoid all jargon and all acronyms. But what you have to do is the instant that you toss one of those out there, you instantly give it an explanation. All right, you unpack it right then and there. And that's fine, you just got to explain it in a way that they can understand it, and use everyday language. Use everyday language. Don't fancy it up, right? No need. Get them to try to see what you're talking about. Again, the visuals are key. Get them to see what you're talking about. See with their mind's eye. As far as a written report or a presentation, all right, complexity is your enemy. The more complex your report and the more complex your testimony or presentation, the worse it's going to be from your audience's perspective. All right? How many of you guys have seen slides like that? Okay? All right? I come from a law enforcement background. You guys know what a flashbang is? All right? That's a cognitive flashbang, right? As soon as you toss it up on the screen, you're done. So they're instantly going to be lost. All right? So what you need to do is do that one concept at a time. One concept at a time. Stair steps. Use builds. If you're going to build an image like that with multiple components, bring them in there with a simple animation, one level at a time, and explain them as you build it. Don't just throw that finished thing up there, build it piece by piece, and what that's going to do is lower that cognitive pressure and manage that cognitive load in a way that your jury can understand it, or your target audience can understand it. So let me ask you this. What is the optimal number of slides in a presentation? How many?
30.
30? Okay. Anybody else? 10. 10? Okay. All right. I'll give you my view on it is whatever it takes. All right. Whatever it takes. Good idea is stick to one slide, one concept. All right. One slide, one concept. In a typical lecture in my classroom, I've got about 70 or 80 slides because I go with, this is what they look like here, with one simple concept at a time. And I'm not doing multiple things, one concept at a time. So I would suggest that you don't need to wrap your head around a magic number. All right, it's whatever it takes. If you have to use 100, use 100. They don't cost anything. You don't have to hang it. It's not, the number of slides is not directly proportional to the amount of time that you've got. You can quickly put something up there that's going to reinforce what you're saying. All right. Just like good writing, it is good writing, all right, and anything you're going to do, revision and editing of the key elements is critical. Definitely revise and edit your slide deck and your reports to try to filter out all the jargon and unclear elements of it. Expose your work to others, particularly those that are representative of your target audience. Give it to your mother, give it to your wife, give it to your friend. Somebody can look at what you're writing or presenting and ask them, do they understand it? And that's going to be a really great barometer on how effective you actually are with what you're doing. So they can give you that idea of how understandable your slides and testimony or presentation will be. They can also do a great job of catching all those jargon and acronyms that we're so used to seeing every day. It gets easy to miss that stuff. All right, it's easy to miss that. So they can be a great resource for you. All right, graphic analogies. All right. So let me ask you this: how would you explain metadata? What would you use as an analogy? Metadata is like
an attribute to a football player.
Like what?
Like an attribute to a football player.
An attribute to a football player. Okay, good. Anybody else? All right. Have you guys ever used a nutrition label on a can of food? Probably everybody, right? So instead of having, the serving size and all that stuff, right? The metadata is going to be like that nutritional information like on a can of soup. It's data about what's inside of that can, right? Same thing with metadata. So everybody there in this example, most everybody has looked at a nutrition label. So it's that is familiar to everybody, right? So when I say metadata is like the nutrition label on a food can, everybody gets that. Instead of saying data about the data, which they may get, but there's a great chance that everybody will understand that one. All right, how about a web browser? How would you analogize a web browser? It's a little harder, right? Perhaps. Here's another example. You say a web browser is like a lens. Okay? So what all that code up there represents, we all know that's really the web page, right? But if you were to pop that up on a screen in front of a presentation or to a judge, jury, or courtroom or boardroom, what's going to happen? It's another flashbang, right? Stunned them. There's no way you lose everybody in the room almost with that. All right? But if we give them that analogy, they all know what a web browser is. All right? And we use that as a lens. So that lens or that browser is going to hide all that unnecessary complexity for us. It makes it easy to understand. All right? How about a link? A lot of folks may understand what a card catalog is. There may be some old bald, gray-haired people in there that understand what that card catalog is, right? How about physical versus logical acquisition? Kind of like an archaeological dig. That logical is going to get stuff at the surface, all right? But that physical acquisition is going to get everything, top and bottom, all the stuff that's hidden and not hidden, all right? How about unallocated space? So this kind of complicated concept, all right? It's probably going to be beneficial, all right, to step in through this. So you start out with a hard drive, all right? Then we may analogize that like a filing cabinet, all right? And then we go to the next step, we could possibly start to color in the drawers to start to show allocated space versus unallocated space. So here we're tying in that technical piece with that filing cabinet that everybody understands, and then we use color, all right, to delineate the differences, allocated versus unallocated. And then we go another step and explain that orange drawers could be empty, right, or they could contain files that you can get rid of. So that's going to be much more effective than some long, detailed explanation about allocated and unallocated space. So there we have the three drawers, allocated in the blue, unallocated and empty, and then unallocated and old data that can be overwritten. How about a hash value? A hash value is like what? Anybody?
Fingerprint.
Good.
Or ID cards.
Okay. All right, good. I like that. We kind of like the whole thing about a digital fingerprint, because everybody knows what a fingerprint is, right? It's unique. Same as a hash value, all right? So we use digital fingerprint or digital DNA. Is a great way to do that. So what made that explanation effective?
Use the analogies so people in the non-technical field would know exactly what to do, but in an easy, without having to explain it for 15 minutes.
Right. So I've got the power of an analogy, and I've also tied that with what? Strong visuals, right? Strong visuals. So now I've activated prior knowledge, and I've also tied into our brain's natural preference, if you will, for visual input. So that's a pretty powerful combination when you can do that. All right, so in the end here, what do we really need to take away from this whole talk? All right, use visuals. Use the visuals in every possible way that you can. If it's in a written report, use really good screenshots. And what I mean by really good screenshots are those that are cropped closely. They don't have a lot of extraneous information in them. Use call-outs, red boxes around what you want them to see, or red arrows, something like that, to call out exactly what you want them to look at. Excuse me, activate that prior knowledge. Think always in terms of what they already know and how can I tie my new information to their prior knowledge. Be extremely mindful of that cognitive load. Do not throw that cognitive flashbang into the room, right? Stair step, complicated subject. One step at a time, step them through it. Do not try to move them too far down that continuum. Just move them to the right a reasonable amount. Now, what that actually is, hard to quantify, but just enough, all right? Keep that in mind. You're not trying to move them from A to Z or even A to M. You just want to get them to C and D, the basics, right? The basics. As experts, we've got a responsibility to the folks that hire us, that call us as expert witnesses. We've got a responsibility. It's up to us to be the guide. It's up to us to do the heavy lifting for them. We need to act as that filter, right? And keep out all the unnecessary detail. Just give them, we owe them that, especially when the stakes are high. May I have any questions? All right. That's all I've got. Thank you very much.